If you ask anyone from New York about the area of Staten Island, you will probably hear about the urban legend of a guy living in the woods who would take children if they wandered too far in the dark. They called him Cropsey. For years, it was just a story that parents would often use to scare their kids into coming home before dark. But in the 1970s, kids actually began to disappear from those woods. The legend of Cropsey is basically the kind of story you'd hear around a campfire when someone wants to freak everyone out. In the legend, he was this escaped asylum patient with a hook for a hand who had broken free from confinement and was hiding in the tunnel system underneath the old Seaview Hospital in Willowbrook. As the legend goes, after nightfall, he would crawl out of those tunnels and wander the streets while searching for kids to carry them back to his hideout. But when they closed the hospital in 1961, the story started to spread everywhere. Kids were constantly bringing it up at camps and sleepovers, and like most urban legends, the story kept changing. Everyone who told it just added their own details to make it more creepy.
First learned about Cropsey in summer camp.
He was a doctor
He was supposed to have a hook.
with a knife about this big.
And he was an axe wielding.
But somewhere between the 70s and 80s, the Cropsey story stopped being a myth because kids on Staten Island actually started disappearing without a trace. To understand what really happened, we have to look back at Willowbrook State School when it started building in 1938. It was originally built as a facility for children with special needs, but during the war, it was converted into a military hospital. It didn't actually open for the kids until 1947, and when it did, the place completely fell apart as it got insanely overcrowded with new students. They were desperate for workers, but because they were underfunded and the conditions were so miserable, they completely dropped their hiring standards and stopped doing background checks. As a result, almost anyone could secure a job there. It was in this environment that Andre Rand was able to secure a job. In 1966, he was hired as a physical therapy aide. People thought he took the job because he used to take care of his mom in a psychiatric hospital. Everyone who worked with him said he was just incredibly creepy. However, Andre had no criminal record at the time, but 2 years later in 1968, he completely abandons his normal life. He quits his job and actually starts living out in the woods around the hospital, building these creepy makeshift campsites that he would return to on and off for nearly 2 decades. And here is where it starts to get really dark. On May 5th, 1969, Andre was actually arrested. Police caught him taking a young girl from the Bronx over to Staten Island. He pleaded guilty to receive a reduced sentence and ended up serving just 16 months before walking out on parole in 1972. And exactly 6 months later, children actually started disappearing. The very first incident happened on July 7th, 1972. Alice Pereira was just playing in the lobby of her apartment building with her older brother. At one point, her brother leaves her alone for just a brief moment, but when he returns, Alice was gone. She had vanished without a trace. The cops' suspicion instantly fell on the building's maintenance worker, who was none other than Andre Rand, a recently paroled inmate. Even though many believed he was responsible for Alice's disappearance, there wasn't enough evidence to convict him. It's genuinely haunting to think that if they had just stopped him right then, the rest of this nightmare would have never happened. On July 15th, 1977, around 2 p.m., 18-year-old Audrey Norenberg told her mother she was going 2 blocks away to a grocery store and would be right back. However, Audrey never returned home and was never found. Just the night before she vanished, Audrey's family had taken her to a movie theater on Staten Island. That theater was right next to one of the wooded campsites where Andre Rand was living. It was believed from there he followed her and was the possible suspect for Audrey's disappearance. But again, there wasn't enough evidence against him. But the story doesn't end there, because over the next few years, more children started vanishing. Holly Ann Hughes, in 1981, walks to a deli just 2 blocks from her house and never makes it back. Then, in 1983, Tia Hees Jackson, her family was staying at a motel after their apartment had burned down. She goes out to get groceries, but never returns. And again, a year later in 1984, a 21-year-old named Henry Gafforio vanished. he had a condition that made him function at a much younger level. He was last seen leaving a bar around 4 a.m. and nobody ever saw him again. Each time someone went missing, people got more and more freaked out. It's one thing to have a cold case, but when the list of children disappearing kept growing and nobody was being arrested, parents on Staten Island started believing the Cropsey legend wasn't just a story.
Don't go down by the lake at night. Cropsey's down there.
No, don't go near Willowbrook Park. Willowbrook Park is dangerous.
The whole thing finally came to an end in the summer of 1987 when 12-year-old Jennifer, who had Down syndrome, vanished while walking near her Staten Island home. People started saying her disappearance was exactly the kind of thing Cropsey would do. However, her case triggered a massive search. Hundreds of volunteers teamed up with the police to search through parks, empty lots, and woods all over the island.
Hi guys, listen, we need all the help we can to help find Jennifer.
The relentless search for a 12-year-old girl with Down syndrome continues today as it has for the last 3 weeks, with the hope that this will be the day they find Jennifer Schweiger.
35 days into the search, a volunteer named Bob Devine was out at the old Willowbrook school grounds when he spotted something haunting, a child's sneaker sticking out of the dirt.
An arm and a leg sticking out from a shallow grave.
Bob had found where Jennifer had been hidden, and Andre Rand's campsite was just 150 feet away, tying him directly to the crime scene. The cops arrested Andre and tried bringing charges against him. Initially, they tried to hold him fully responsible for what happened to Jennifer, but due to lack of physical evidence, he was only convicted of abduction. Andre was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Then, 16 years later in 2004, the state finally proved he was the one who had taken Holly Ann Hughes as well in 1981, which added an additional 25-year sentence to his time, basically guaranteeing that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Even though Andre was finally behind bars, most people believe he's responsible for multiple other disappearances that remain unsolved. However, for those families, there was never really any closure, just the unsettling fact that the urban legend of Cropsey was actually real, making it one of the darkest chapters in Staten Island history. When you hear about urban legends, you definitely don't picture a guy in a giant rabbit costume wielding a hatchet, but that's exactly what people in Virginia were dealing with in the year of 1970. The Bunnyman wasn't just a campfire story. He was a deeply disturbed and dangerous person roaming the streets. The legend of the Bunnyman traces back to 1904. There was an asylum in Clifton, Virginia, which was shut down. They were supposedly moving the patients somewhere else, and during the transfer, one of them escaped into the woods. People say he survived by catching rabbits and would hang the remains on the tree near the Colchester overpass. There were rumors that he would start attacking anyone who got too close, and that's how we got the name Bunnyman. But the truth is, there was never actually an asylum in Clifton back in 1904, and the whole escape story was completely made up. In fact, it was added later to make the legend creepier. But then, decades later, on October 19, 1970, Robert Bennett, a cadet in the U.S. Air Force Academy, and his fiancée were driving home from a football game, but they made a quick stop near Guinea Road to see a relative. They park along the edge of a field, but before Bennett can even turn off the engine, he sees something move in the rearview mirror. And out of nowhere, the passenger window just shatters and a man starts screaming at them. They panicked and sped off, but only after driving away, they realized an axe had just smashed through the window. Terrified of what just happened, they headed to the police station and the couple gave their statements. Bennett insisted the attacker wore a white suit with long rabbit ears, but the cops weren't convinced at all. With Halloween just around the corner, officers brushed it off as a bad prank. Only 10 days later, after the first sighting, something else also happened on Guinea Road. Paul Phillips, a security guard at a construction site, was doing his rounds when he noticed someone standing on the porch of a half-built house. The figure stared at him, and Phillips immediately felt uneasy. He saw the man was dressed in a strange costume made of gray, black, and white fur, something resembling a rabbit. And then, without saying a word, the man pulled out a long-handled axe. Phillips tried speaking to him, but the figure started chopping the pole at the property and yelled, "All you people trespass around here. If you don't get out of here, I'm going to bust you on the head." But realizing he was unarmed, Phillips walked back to his car to arm himself. But the figure carrying the long-handled axe had already run off into the woods. However, over the next few weeks, more than 50 people called the police, claiming to have seen the man in the fursuit. It wasn't just a local rumor, it was all over the news. Even the Washington Post was running front-page headlines like "Man in a bunny suit sought in Fairfax" and "Bunnyman strikes again." This kind of media attention only added to the growing panic. One disturbing claim said the Bunnyman had struck a neighbor's cat, which was found lifeless on the lawn. As more people shared stories, it became impossible to tell whether something was real or just made up. Maybe some of those 50 callers really saw something, while others just wanted to be part of the story. But either way, the community was filled with fear. Despite dozens of reports, police never found the man. The cases were closed, but the mystery remains, as in Fairfax County, people are still aware of the legend, and anybody walking alone at night near those woods couldn't help but wonder if the Bunnyman is still out there. Candyman. The legend of Candyman is a dare. You stand in front of a mirror and say his name 5 times.
Candyman, Candyman, Candyman.
A ghost will show up behind you with a hook for a hand. The backstory is that he was a black artist in the late 1800s who fell in love with a white woman, and a local mob severed his hand, covered him in honey, and left him to die from the bees. Now, as the story goes, he comes back as this vengeful spirit, haunting bathroom mirrors with a hook for a hand. At first, it sounds like a pure fictional horror story, something that people would say before daring each other to test this in the bathroom mirror. But what makes it unsettling is the real-life case it was actually inspired by. It was around 8:45 p.m. on April 22nd, 1987, when 52-year-old Ruthie Mae McCoy dialed 911 in pure panic. She was terrified and told the dispatcher that someone was trying to break into her apartment through the bathroom mirror. Now, Ruthie suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, which is a condition that causes extreme paranoia and hallucinations. Because the dispatcher was aware of this, they immediately assumed she was hallucinating right now. The dispatcher logged the call as a neighbor disturbance, which meant the responding officers did not treat it with urgency. But this time, she was telling the truth. However, within the next 20 minutes, 2 additional calls were made by neighbors of Ruthie. Around 9 p.m., a neighbor was walking down the hallway when they heard a series of loud bangs coming from Ruthie's place, and just 2 minutes later, another neighbor called to report the same thing and said that they heard someone screaming as well. At that point, authorities headed to Ruthie's apartment. They arrived at approximately 9:10 p.m. and repeatedly knocked on her door. Officers even had the dispatcher redial the number from the original 911 call and could hear the phone ringing inside the apartment. Therefore, they requested building security to unlock the door. But security was unable to locate the correct keys. Given the situation, you would think the police would have just forced their way in, but surprisingly, they just left and returned on the next day. They considered forcing their way inside, but once again, they were persuaded by security to hold off. It was not until April 24th, 2 days after the initial incident, that a carpenter finally opened the door. When they finally got into her apartment, they found Ruthie in her bedroom. She suffered fatal injuries during the break-in and had passed away. Given the nature of her injuries, she likely didn't have much time to react. It was a tragic scene, and it became clear that the call she made to 911 about someone breaking in had actually been real. When police searched the apartment, several of her belongings were missing, including her cash. Ruthie's disability payments had recently increased, making investigators wonder if she had been specifically targeted for a robbery. But the most messed up part was the missing phone, the exact same phone officers had heard ringing just 2 days earlier. That single unsettling detail suggested that the intruders were either standing silently inside the apartment while the police were outside knocking, or they had confidently returned later to remove the evidence. Then, investigators walked into her bathroom. The cabinet was completely gone, leaving just an open space where you could see the pipes, and through those pipes, you could actually get into the apartment next door. It soon became clear that the intruders had entered through the bathroom cabinet, essentially breaking in through the shared wall. As unbelievable as it first sounded, authorities later learned that this wasn't the first time it happened. 4 years ago, in 1983, Ruthie's basement apartment had completely flooded, which forced her to apply for emergency housing. However, she had requested not to be placed in a high-rise building, but the waiting list was too long, and she was eventually given an apartment on the 11th floor of a 15-story building. Her new building was in terrible condition. Elevators, lights, and plumbing often didn't work. The bathroom cabinets in the apartments were back-to-back, which means the walls of one apartment's bathroom were right against the next apartment's bathroom, and there was a 2-foot narrow service gap running between the walls behind the cabinets. They were barely nailed in, so it would be easier for plumbers to get in and fix the pipes. Break-ins through these cabinets were common because all it took was removing a few screws, crawling through the wall, and pushing out the cabinet on the other side. Many residents would block their bathroom doors with furniture at night to avoid using it. To make matters worse, nearly 30 of the 148 units in the building were empty, and drug dealers often used them. One of those empty apartments happened to be right next door to Ruthie. One witness told police he saw 2 men carrying items away from Ruth's apartment in the early hours after the complaints and shortly afterward. Police made 2 arrests, but prosecutors were unable to build a strong case, and the charges were eventually dropped for lack of evidence. Ruth's daughter filed a lawsuit against the Chicago Housing Authority, but her case did not succeed either, and in the end, it was her tragedy from which the legend of Candyman was born. Toxic Lady. The story around this urban legend is that there was a woman who was so dangerous just standing in the same room as her could end you. Rumors said her skin was radioactive or that she was cursed. It sounds like a made-up horror movie concept, but the reason this story exists is because it actually happened. It was February 1994 in Riverside, California. A mother named Gloria Ramirez was rushed to the ER around 8:15 p.m. She was fighting late-stage cancer, and that night her blood pressure was crashing and her heart rate was dangerously out of control. While the medical team was trying to stabilize her using defibrillation, staff observed unusual details. Her skin appeared to have an oily layer, and there was a strange sweet garlic-like smell coming from her mouth. Also, when her blood was drawn, staff noticed a chemical-like odor and some unusual yellowish particles floating in the sample. Soon after, a nurse who handled the blood sample fainted and reported a burning feeling on her skin. Another staff member also collapsed. As more workers began feeling unwell, the hospital declared an internal emergency. Other patients were moved outside, while a small team continued trying to save Gloria. Despite all the efforts to treat her, they couldn't save her. Unfortunately, Gloria passed away at about 8:50 p.m. But by the end of the night, 23 different hospital members reported symptoms of illness. Some cases were severe, and one medical trainee required months to recover. Because no one knew what caused the illnesses, Gloria's room was completely sealed off, and the staff had to bring in hazmat suits. The health department team arrived at 11 p.m., 2 hours after the incident. They examined the hospital and questioned staff members. They conducted a thorough search of the facility, but did not discover any toxic substances. Even after strict medical examinations of Gloria, they still couldn't find a proper explanation about the incident. Local authorities later referred to the event as one of the most mysterious medical cases in the region's history. They ultimately determined that there was no chemical leak and proposed that the symptoms might have resulted from the panic sparked by fear. But several affected staff members rejected this conclusion, insisting that their physical reactions could not be solely because of anxiety. However, the incident eventually turned into an urban myth, and the case became widely known as the Toxic Lady.
It is one of the most bizarre medical mysteries in recent memory, and doctors still can't explain it.
The media gave her this nickname, and rumors quickly spread, claiming that her body was so poisonous it made anyone nearby ill. Even even though there are so many theories about the case, I will talk about the most logical one. It gets a bit nerdy, but stay with me. Scientists at the Livermore Laboratory discovered unusually high levels of a compound called dimethylsulfone in Gloria's system. They proposed that Gloria may have been using an anti-inflammatory gel to relieve her cancer pain. That gel contains a chemical called DMSO, which explains the oily sheen on her skin and that weird garlic smell. Now, DMSO by itself is completely harmless, but when she was rushed into the ER, the medical team put an oxygen mask over her. The theory is that the oxygen mixed with the gel in her system had created a totally new compound called dimethylsulfone. That actually explains those yellowish white crystals the nurses saw floating in her blood sample. But there was still a problem. The second chemical is also harmless. It shouldn't have hurt anyone. But when her heart started failing, the doctors hit her with the defibrillator. Scientists believe the electric shock from those acted as a trigger and forced that harmless chemical to react with the natural sulfates already inside her system, and it created a third, entirely new chemical, dimethyl sulfate. Now, dimethyl sulfate is a highly toxic chemical known to damage the heart, liver, and kidneys. It can also cause symptoms such as paralysis and convulsions, effects similar to those reported by the hospital staff that night. But even with this incredibly detailed theory, a lot of scientists still call it completely impossible. They argue that a human body simply cannot act as a chemical reactor like that. So to this day, nobody actually knows for sure what happened in that room. But over time, the case turned into an urban legend, with people claiming that the woman herself was poisonous. Back in the 1950s, there was a legend that if you were driving down State Route 351 in Pennsylvania, you might come across a ghost with a disfigured face. The story was that he had no visible eyes, no nose, and his skin would actually glow in the dark. Locals called him the Green Man, or sometimes Charlie No Face. People even started saying his skin glowed green because of radiation, and that he'd hang out in these dead-end roads just to jump out and attack travelers. Some local teenagers even turned it into kind of a challenge. Late at night, they would slowly drive along the route with their headlights on, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Green Man. People didn't know if he was a ghost or a monster lurking in the dark, but just like the Cropsey legend, the Green Man wasn't a ghost. But unlike Andre Rand, he wasn't a monster, because the truth about who he was is actually a lot more heartbreaking. To understand this story, we have to go all the way back to June 18, 1919. 8-year-old Raymond Robinson was playing with his friends near a railroad bridge over Wallace Run in Pennsylvania. They spotted a bird's nest on the bridge and immediately started daring each other to climb up and get a closer look. However, this bridge was notoriously dangerous because just months earlier, in September 1918, a 12-year-old boy named Robert Littell had lost his life after touching an electrical line on the same bridge. Ray and his friends were reportedly aware of this tragedy, yet he decided to climb the bridge anyway. Raymond said, "Who will see how many birds are in that nest?" His friend replied, "Not me. There are electrical wires up there, and a little fellow lost his life up there 6 months ago." But Raymond simply replied, "Well, I will find out." While trying to reach the bird's nest, Raymond also accidentally made contact with that high voltage power line, and the results were devastating. The surge caused severe injuries to his upper body. He ended up losing his sight, his nose, his hearing on one side, and part of his arm, leaving his face permanently altered. But unlike the boy who passed away the year before, Raymond survived, and only 2 months after the accident, newspapers reported that in spite of all his affliction, the boy is in good humor. This positive attitude became one of his defining traits. As one of his nephews later said, he never complained about anything. As he grew into an adult, he spent hours listening to the radio and making handmade items like belts and wallets to earn a living, even mowing the lawn despite his blindness. However, Raymond usually avoided going out during the day because his appearance often drew unwanted attention. He would sometimes wear a prosthetic nose attached to a pair of glasses just to blend in, but he still enjoyed taking quiet walks along wooded trails at night. Using a walking stick, he carefully kept one foot on the paved path and one just off the side so he could navigate safely in the pitch black. That's exactly when the legend of the Green Man began to take shape. During Raymond's nighttime walks, high school students would spot him from their cars along State Route 351. The nickname Green Man likely came from the way car headlights reflected off his clothing as he walked in the dark. However, most local residents actually referred to him as Charlie No-Face. The name Green Man was more commonly used by people from neighboring towns. If you didn't know about Raymond, spotting him in the dark like this would definitely be scary. Some people wanted to call the police, or they would drive as fast as they could, but for the locals who actually knew him, they would often go out to look for him like a nighttime tradition. Pull over, hand him a cigarette or a beer, and just hang out in the dark. Unfortunately, not everyone was kind. One person actually offered Raymond a ride, only to drop him off somewhere unfamiliar as a joke on the blind man. Despite such mistreatment, Raymond was remembered as genuinely kind. They said he was a hell of a nice guy. Raymond Robinson, aka the Green Man, passed away from natural causes on June 11, 1985, at the age of 74. The urban legend of Green Man was true, but he wasn't a ghost. He was just Raymond.